Welcome to Affair Crimes Uncovered. Enjoy this true crime story. The sun rose slowly over the sleepy town of Millbrook, Georgia, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. As the church bells chimed, signaling the start of another Sunday service, the residents of this tight-knit community made their way to the old white chapel that stood at the heart of their town. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. With a population of just over 2,000 people, it was a town where gossip spread faster than wildfire and secrets were hard to keep. But on this particular Sunday morning, no one could have predicted the dark events that were about to unfold. Pastor David Thompson, a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and kind eyes, stood at the pulpit, ready to deliver his weekly sermon. The pews were filled with familiar faces, families who had attended this church for generations, elderly couples who had been married in this very building, and young children fidgeting in their Sunday best. As the congregation settled in, a late arrival slipped through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church. Heads turned to see who had dared to be tardy, but the newcomer kept their head down, quickly finding a seat in the last row. Little did anyone know that this seemingly ordinary Sunday would be the last time Pastor Thompson would stand before his flock. The service proceeded as usual, with hymns sung and prayers offered. But as Pastor Thompson neared the end of his sermon, something strange happened. His words began to slur, and he gripped the edges of the pulpit tightly. Concerned murmurs rippled through the congregation. Suddenly, the pastor's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. Chaos erupted as people rushed forward to help. Among them was Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a local physician who happened to be in attendance that day. "Give him some space," she shouted, pushing through the crowd. But as she knelt beside the fallen pastor, her face grew pale. She checked for a pulse, then looked up at the anxious faces surrounding her. "Call 911, she said grimly. "He's not breathing." As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, a sense of dread settled over the church. Pastor Thompson, beloved by all, was pronounced dead at the scene. What initially seemed like a tragic case of natural causes quickly took a sinister turn when the paramedics noticed something odd: a small puncture wound on the back of the pastor's neck. Detective Jack Morgan was enjoying a rare day off when he got the call. A homicide in Millbrook was unheard of, and the fact that it happened in the town's church made it all the more shocking. As he drove to the scene, his mind raced with possibilities. The church was now a crime scene, yellow tape cordoning off the area as curious onlookers gathered outside. Inside, forensic teams combed every inch of the building, looking for clues. "What have we got?" Jack asked his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, as he ducked under the tape. Lisa, a no-nonsense woman in her 30s, flipped open her notebook. "Victim is David Thompson, 56, pastor of this church for the last 20 years. Collapsed during the service. Cause of death appears to be poison, delivered through a small puncture wound on the back of his neck." Jack frowned. "Poison? That's unusual. Any suspects?" Lisa shook her head. "Not yet, but in a town this small, everyone's a suspect." As they began interviewing witnesses, one thing became clear. No one had seen anything suspicious. The late arrival was identified as Mary Simmons, a regular churchgoer who had simply overslept. But as Jack would soon learn, in Millbrook, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Over the next few days, the investigation turned the quiet town of Millbrook upside down. As Jack and Lisa dug deeper into Pastor Thompson's life, they discovered that the beloved preacher had his share of secrets. Financial records showed large sums of money being transferred out of the church's accounts. Was the pastor embezzling funds? And if so, who else knew about it? Interviews with church members revealed whispered rumors of affairs and indiscretions. Sarah Miller, a young single mother, broke down during questioning, admitting to a long-term relationship with the married pastor. "He promised he'd leave his wife," she sobbed. "He said we'd be together." But perhaps the most shocking revelation came from the pastor's own family. His teenage daughter, Emily, came forward with a disturbing story. "Dad wasn't who everyone thought he was," she said, her voice trembling. He hurt people, and he made me keep quiet about it." As the detectives pieced together the puzzle, they realized they were dealing with a man who had carefully crafted a public image that was far from the truth. But was it enough to get him killed? As news of Pastor Thompson's dark side spread through Millbrook, the list of potential suspects grew. There was Robert Jenkins, the church treasurer who had confronted the pastor about the missing funds. Sarah Miller's brother Tom, who had threatened the pastor after learning of the affair. And what about Emily's boyfriend, a troubled youth named Jason who had a history of violence? Each suspect had a motive, but none seemed to have the means or opportunity to commit such a calculated murder. The poison used was a rare and potent neurotoxin, not something easily obtained in a small town like Millbrook. As Jack and Lisa followed lead after lead, they found themselves running into dead ends. It seemed that for every question they answered, two more took its place. The town, once so close-knit, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and fear. Neighbors eyed each other warily, wondering who among them could be capable of such a heinous act. Weeks passed and the investigation seemed to stall. The initial shock of the murder had given way to a simmering tension that permeated every aspect of life in Millbrook. The church, once the center of community life, stood empty and forlorn. Many residents, disillusioned by the revelations about their pastor, had turned their backs on their faith. Others clung to it more tightly, desperate for something to believe in. Jack and Lisa found themselves caught in the middle of a town torn apart. Every interview, every piece of evidence seemed to lead them in circles. They knew the killer was out there, hiding in plain sight, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. As frustration mounted, so did the pressure from their superiors to solve the case. The media had gotten wind of the story, and reporters from Atlanta began descending on Millbrook, eager for a juicy story about murder in a small town. As Detective Jack Morgan and his partner Lisa Chen delved deeper into the evidence found in the hidden room, a chilling picture began to emerge. The church elders, once considered pillars of the community, who had served alongside Pastor Thompson for years, were not the righteous leaders they pretended to be. Jack spread the documents across the precinct's conference table, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of financial records. "They've been siphoning money from the church funds for years. Thompson knew about it, and he was taking his cut." Lisa leaned in, her eyes widening as she scanned the papers. So when Thompson threatened to expose them, they decided to eliminate the threat, Jack finished grimly. The detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together the conspiracy one clue at a time. They discovered that the church elders had initially confronted Pastor Thompson, demanding he step down and confess his sins to the congregation. But the pastor, arrogant in his belief that he was untouchable, had refused. "You can't touch me," Thompson had sneered during that fateful meeting, his voice dripping with contempt. "If I go down, I'm taking all of you with me." It was this threat that had pushed the elders over the edge. Faced with the destruction of their reputations and the potential collapse of the church they had devoted their lives to, they had made a fateful decision that would forever change the face of Millbrook. One by one, the conspirators were brought in for questioning. The interrogation room became a confessional of sorts, where long-buried secrets were finally brought to light. First was Harold Simmons, the eldest of the group. His weathered hands shook as he clasped them on the table. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he whispered, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "We thought we were protecting the church." Next came Margaret Holloway, her once proud posture now slumped in defeat. "David was going to ruin us all," she spat, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and defiance. "We had no choice." Some broke down immediately, the weight of their guilt too heavy to bear. Others held out, maintaining their innocence, until confronted with the overwhelming evidence against them. But as the hours ticked by, the full extent of their plot was revealed. The poison had been obtained by Dr. Richard Evans, a retired pharmacist with connections to a medical research facility. His medical knowledge had made him the perfect person to acquire the lethal neurotoxin. "It was supposed to be quick and painless," Dr. Evans mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "A mercy, really." Another elder, James Cooper, a former engineer, had created the device used to deliver the fatal dose, a modified pen that, when pressed against the skin, would inject the toxin without leaving a visible mark. The ingenuity of the weapon sent chills down the detectives' spines. As Jack listened to their confessions, he couldn't help but feel a mix of disgust and pity. These were people who had baptized babies, officiated weddings, and comforted the grieving. Now they sat before him as murderers. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when they interviewed Thomas Bradshaw, the elder who had delivered the fatal dose. On that fateful Sunday morning, as Pastor Thompson delivered what would be his final sermon, Bradshaw had approached him from behind, ostensibly to whisper a prayer in his ear. Instead, he had pressed the poisoned pen to the pastor's neck, sealing his fate. "I can still hear the words he was preaching," Bradshaw said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." The irony of it all hit me at that moment, but it was too late to turn back. As the last confession was recorded and the case file was closed, Jack and Lisa stood in silence, the weight of what they had uncovered settling heavily upon them. They had solved the murder, but the ripple effects of this conspiracy would be felt in Millbrook for years to come. The arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook. 5 respected members of the community, people who had been trusted and revered for decades, now stood accused of a crime that had shaken the town to its core. As news spread, residents gathered in small groups on street corners and in coffee shops, trying to make sense of the betrayal. The town's sense of security had been shattered, replaced by a creeping suspicion that if these pillars of the community could fall, anyone could be hiding dark secrets. The trial became the center of attention, not just for Millbrook, but for the entire state of Georgia. News vans lined the streets, and reporters camped out in front of the courthouse, eager for any tidbit of information they could use in their sensational headlines. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The defendants, once proud and respected, now sat with slumped shoulders, their faces etched with lines of worry and shame. As the prosecution presented its case, gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. The depth of the deception and the cold-blooded nature of the murder shocked even those who thought they had heard it all during the investigation. Defense attorneys argued passionately, painting their clients as misguided individuals who had lost their way, but ultimately had the church's best interests at heart. But as witness after witness took the stand, recounting years of financial mismanagement, cover-ups, and the fatal decision to eliminate Pastor Thompson, it became clear that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome the mountain of evidence. The most poignant moment of the trial came when Emily Thompson, the pastor's daughter, took the stand. Her testimony about her father's true nature and the abuse she had suffered added another layer of complexity to the case. As she spoke, many in the courtroom wept, realizing that the tragedy ran deeper than they had ever imagined. "I don't condone what they did," Emily said, her voice strong despite her tears. "But I understand the desperation that drove them to it. My father hurt a lot of people, and the church let it happen for far too long." After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was finally announced. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read out the decision, guilty on all counts. The 5 conspirators were sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As the gavel fell, sealing their fate, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the town of Millbrook. There was no joy in the verdict, no sense of victory. Instead, a somber realization settled over the community. They would need to find a way to move forward, to rebuild not just their church, but their trust in one another. In the months that followed, Millbrook struggled to heal. The church stood empty, its doors locked as the community grappled with the question of whether it could ever be a place of worship again. Some argued that it should be torn down, a physical reminder of the pain and betrayal wiped from existence. Others believed that it could be redeemed, turned into a symbol of renewal and second chances. Detective Jack Morgan, who had been at the center of the investigation, found himself unable to let go of the case even after its resolution. He spent many nights sitting in his car outside the church, wondering how a community could recover from such a profound breach of trust. It was on one such night, nearly a year after the murder, that he noticed a light on in the church. Curious, he approached, peering through the windows to see a small group of people inside. They were cleaning, scrubbing away years of dust and neglect. Among them, he recognized Sarah Miller, the young single mother who had been involved with Pastor Thompson. She caught sight of Jack and came to the door. "We're reclaiming it," she said simply, gesturing to the others inside. "Not as a place of blind faith, but as a community center, a place where we can come together, talk openly about our problems, and help each other heal." Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As word spread about the efforts to repurpose the church, more and more residents began to get involved. The building that had once been a source of pain and division was slowly transformed into a symbol of the town's resilience and determination to move forward. 1 year to the day after the murder that shook Millbrook to its core, the doors of the old church building opened once again. But this time, it wasn't for a traditional service. Instead, it was for the grand opening of the Millbrook Community Center. Detective Jack Morgan stood at the back of the room, watching as people filed in. There were familiar faces, survivors of the tragedy who had found the strength to return. There were also new faces, young families who had moved to Millbrook in the wake of the scandal, drawn by the town's commitment to transparency and healing. As the crowd settled, Sarah Miller stepped up to the podium. In the year since the trial, she had emerged as a leader in the community's healing process. Her journey from victim to advocate had inspired many. "We gather here today," she began, her voice strong and clear, "not to forget the past, but to learn from it. To remember that true community is not about blind obedience or keeping up appearances, but about compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult it may be." As her words washed over the gathering, Jack saw heads nodding, tears being wiped away, and tentative smiles appearing on faces that had been grim for far too long. "This center," Sarah continued, "will be a place of education, support, and open dialogue. We'll have counseling services, youth programs, and community forums. But most importantly, it will be a place where everyone's voice can be heard, where no secret is too dark to bring into the light." The applause that followed was tentative at first, then grew in strength. It was the sound of a community ready to take its first steps toward true healing. As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, sharing refreshments and cautious hope, Jack slipped out of the building. He stood on the steps, breathing in the warm Georgia air, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Millbrook would never be the same. The innocence of small-town life had been shattered, replaced by a hard-won wisdom. But as Jack watched families enter the community center, children laughing, and parents talking openly about their hopes and fears, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps out of this darkness, something stronger and more genuine could grow. As he walked to his car, the sound of conversation and laughter drifted from the open windows of the center. The church bells, silent for so long, began to ring out. Their clear tones echoed through the town, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a call to what could be, a future built on honesty, accountability, and the unbreakable bonds of a community that had weathered the storm together. Jack smiled to himself as he drove away. Millbrook's darkest chapter had been written, but its story was far from over, and he had a feeling that the next chapters would be filled with hope, redemption, and the kind of faith that comes not from blind obedience, but from facing hard truths and choosing to move forward together.